I've been a program coordinator for this charity for almost 3 years now. And in all that time, I never thought I would be standing waist-deep in the Atlantic Ocean in a wetsuit that was cutting off circulation to my left hip, watching Prince Harry press his forehead briefly against the top of a surfboard, while a one-armed instructor named Marcus said something to him that the wind took before it could reach anyone else on the beach. That is where I want to start, not at the briefing, not at the moment the Range Rover pulled into the car park, but at that exact second, out past the brake line, when the two of them were floating in gray Cornish water, and whatever Harry had been carrying into the sea that morning appeared for just a moment to loosen its grip. I was the only one watching from that angle. Everyone else was closer to shore. My name is not important for this. Call me Nora. That is what everyone at the charity calls me, and it will do. I am 31. I have a desk near a window that looks out onto a car park, and my job involves spreadsheets, volunteer rotas, grant applications, and occasionally standing on cold beaches in borrowed wetsuits pretending I know what I am doing. I am not a therapist. I am not a surfer. I am the person who makes sure the right people are in the right place at the right time, and then stays quietly out of the way while they do something that actually matters. The morning had started, as many significant mornings in my life have, with a problem I could do nothing about. My colleague Bex had called in sick at 7:20. I had been eating toast over my kitchen sink when my phone lit up with her message. She was the one who was supposed to attend today. She had the media liaison training, the VIP protocol briefing, the experience of having once coordinated a visit from a government minister without anything going visibly wrong. She also, crucially, had the right wetsuit. The message she sent me read as follows: "Sorry, Nora. Stomach. Wetsuit is in the cupboard under the stairs. It might be slightly small, but you'll be fine. Everything is in the folder on the shared drive. You are so much more capable than you think you are. Please don't let Diane rewrite the running order again." The wetsuit was not slightly small. The wetsuit was a full size smaller than anything I had ever worn, and I made the mistake of putting it on in Bex's hallway before driving to Cornwall, which meant I spent the entire 2-hour journey on the A30 encased in neoprene like a sausage that had been vacuum packed against its will. By the time I reached the Fistral Beach car park, the suit had migrated upward in a way that I could feel, but could not, with any dignity, address while standing next to a charity minibus. My director, Diane, was already there. Diane is 53, Welsh, and approaches event logistics the way a military commander approaches a siege. She had a clipboard, a laminated running order, a spare laminated running order, and an expression that suggested she had been awake since 5. She looked at me when I got out of the car, then at the wetsuit, then back at me. "Where is Bex?" she said. "Stomach," I said. Diane pressed her lips together. "The photographer from the charity press team arrives at 9:30. I need you to stand slightly behind me when the vehicle arrives and not wave." "I was not going to wave," I said. "People wave," she said, and turned back to her clipboard. The beach itself was not the Cornwall of a tourist brochure. It was a Tuesday in late September, and the sky was the particular shade of gray that English skis achieve when they are not quite committing to rain, but want you to know the option is on the table. The sand was dark and damp from the night before. The waves were larger than the forecast had suggested, coming in at a diagonal that Marcus had apparently already assessed and approved, because he was already in the water when we arrived, standing chest-deep in the Atlantic looking entirely unbothered, like a man waiting for a bus that he knew would come. Marcus had been running the surf program for the charity for 4 years. He was 47, mixed race, built like someone who had spent a long time doing physical things in difficult conditions, which he had 2 tore, a roadside device, and the loss of his left arm below the elbow at 38. He did not talk about any of this unless he chose to. He had a way of speaking that reminded me of the way some people handle sharp tools, carefully, deliberately, only when necessary. When he spoke, people listened, not because he was loud, because he was precise. Royson arrived next. She was the occupational therapist attached to the program, 39, from Sligo originally, with red hair pinned back and a manner of paying attention to things that was so thorough it occasionally made you feel slightly transparent, as if she could see the actual mechanisms of you moving behind your face. She had worked with veterans for 12 years. She had told me once, over a very bad cup of coffee in the charity office in Truro, that the ocean was one of the few therapeutic environments where the environment itself did most of the work. You just had to get people into it and then trust what happened next. She set up a small area at the back of the beach, 2 benches, a wind shelter, a thermos, a roll of waterproof medical tape. Nothing clinical, nothing that looked like a clinic. This was deliberate. The veterans arrived at 9 o'clock in a minibus, 6 of them, ranging in age from 24 to 51. I will not describe all of them individually because this is not their story to be told here. But I want to say something about Theo because Theo is important to what happened later. Theo was 24. He had left the army 14 months ago after a period of service he had not, as far as I understood from the program notes, fully processed in any direction. He was tall, lean, with close-cropped hair and the look of someone who was doing a very controlled impression of being fine. He walked off the minibus behind the others, and when the group moved toward the beach, he stopped at the edge of the sand. Not dramatically. He did not freeze or make a sound. He simply stopped as if the sand itself was a threshold he was not sure he had permission to cross. The others had moved ahead. He stood there for a moment looking at the water. Then he looked down at his shoes. Then he took 1 step forward and kept walking, and I do not think anyone else noticed this except Royson, who was watching from the shelter, and me, who was standing off to the side pretending to read something on my clipboard while actually being incapable of looking away. I tugged at the side of the wetsuit. It had ridden up again. The Range Rover arrived at 9:22. There were 2 of them, actually, the car Harry was in, and a second vehicle slightly behind it, carrying 2 protection officers who spent the rest of the morning standing at the top of the beach path, looking out at the ocean, with the particular expressions of people who have accepted that their job is occasionally absurd. I had been told, in the briefing document Bex had helpfully placed in the shared drive, that Prince Harry was likely to be informal, that he preferred first names, that he had strong feelings about veterans' mental health provision, which was not a talking point but a lived position, and that the visit was not to be framed as a royal endorsement, but as a personal appearance by someone who had served and who cared about the people in this program. What the briefing had not prepared me for was the speed at which he crossed the beach. He did not wait for Diane to finish her welcome. He let her get through 2 sentences. She was very good, Diane, smooth and warm. And then he was already moving toward the group, hand extended, saying hello to people by name from the briefing sheet he had clearly actually read. He shook hands with Royson and asked her a specific question about the neuroscience of cold water immersion that I could tell she had not expected and was delighted by. He shook hands with the veterans one by one, and with each one there was a beat, not long, just a breath, where he looked at them with something that was not pity and was not performance. It was recognition, the kind that passes between people who have stood in some of the same places. When he reached Marcus, he said, "Already been in, have you?" Marcus looked at him steadily. "Check the brake, it is running well." "Good," Harry said. "Can we get in before the briefing, or does someone need me to sit through slides first?" Marcus almost smiled. "No slides," he said. "Thank God," said Harry. I was standing slightly behind Diane at this point, as instructed, holding my clipboard with both hands so I had a reason not to wave. When Harry worked his way to me, I did the thing I had been told not to do. I started to say my full name and my role and how long I had been with the charity, all in one sentence, like a person reading off a card. He waited patiently until I ran out of words and then said, "Are you warm enough in that? The water is about 14 degrees today." I looked down at the wetsuit, which had ridden up on the left side to a degree that was now architecturally impressive. "It is fine," I said. "It is borrowed." He nodded as if this was a perfectly normal thing. Borrowed gear is always either too big or too small, never the right size. He moved on. I exhaled. Marcus gathered the group at the waterline at 9:40. He did not give a speech. He gave instructions, short and physical, how to lie on the board, how to read the wave, what to do when you fall, which was not if but when, and which was, I understood later, a therapeutic point as much as a practical one. The whole framework of the program rested on the idea that falling was expected, built in, nothing to recover from except the fall itself. Harry was in the line with the veterans, not slightly apart, not at the end in a way that suggested supervision. In the middle, between a man called Derek, who was 51 and had been surfing before, and Theo, who was gripping his board with both hands and staring at the horizon with the expression of someone who had decided to do a thing and was now questioning every decision that had led to this moment. Marcus walked them into the water. The first wave came early and with more force than it looked from the shore. It took 5 of the 6 clean off their boards, including Harry, who went under with his legs in the air in a way that was so completely ungainly that by the time he surfaced, shaking water from his ears, half the group was already laughing. Harry looked at Derek, who was laughing the hardest, and pointed at him and said something I could not hear over the surf, and Derek laughed harder, and the thing that had been tight in the group since the minibus, that invisible wire of self-consciousness and hypervigilance, went slack for just a moment. I felt it from the shore. Royson beside me said nothing, but she was watching. The session ran for 45 minutes. I will not describe all of it because the truth is I spent portions of it wrestling quietly with my wetsuit, which had developed opinions about my torso that I did not share. I will say that what I watched was not what I had expected. I had expected something visually tidy, veterans triumphantly standing on boards, photogenic waves, a prince cheering from a respectful distance. What I watched was messier and more honest than that. People fell constantly. Marcus corrected posture and grip with his one hand, and a patience that seemed inexhaustible. Royson walked into the shallows at one point and said something to a man named Patrick who had gone quiet in a way she apparently recognized, and then Patrick paddled back out and tried again. Harry fell at least 7 times that I counted, and each time he came up he shook the water off his face and paddled straight back, and there was no implication in any of it that falling was embarrassing or that the point was not to fall. The point was something else. I was not yet sure what. It was during one of the rest periods. Marcus brought the group back to waist depth for a few minutes, letting the water hold them while their arms recovered. That Royson came to stand beside me. "He is doing well," I said, meaning Harry, because he was. He had found a rhythm by the 3rd wave and was now helping Derek read the set. Royson looked at me sideways. "Yes," she said, and then after a pause that had weight in it, "He is not here for them today, not entirely." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She kept her eyes on the water. "I have been watching him since he arrived. The way he moved onto the beach, the way he listened to Marcus. He has the look of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has decided today to set it down somewhere and see what happens." She paused again. "I have seen it before, usually in the first session, usually in the participants." I did not say anything for a moment. The waves came in and went out. "Should we?" I started. "No," Royson said very gently. "We should do exactly nothing. Marcus knows that is enough." I tugged at the wetsuit. It had migrated again, this time with a determination that suggested it had given up pretending to be the right size and had simply committed to its own agenda. I left it. At some point during the second half of the session, Harry and Marcus ended up out past the break line together. I am not entirely sure how it happened. The group had spread naturally across the water as people grew more confident, and the 2 of them were simply suddenly further out than the rest, sitting up on their boards in the deep water. the waves lifting and lowering them in long, slow rhythms. The photographers from the charity press team were on the ridge above the beach. They had long lenses. They were capturing the group shots, the standing moments, the falls, and the recoveries. They were not pointed at the two figures past the break line because nothing appeared to be happening there. Harry said something. Marcus said something back. Harry nodded. Then he did the thing I mentioned at the beginning. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead briefly against the top of his board. Not dramatically. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then he sat up again, and the two of them stayed there for another minute in the water, not talking, just watching the horizon, and then a wave came through and they both turned and paddled back toward the group. When Harry came back into the shallower water, his face was different. I want to be careful here because I am a program coordinator and not a therapist, and I do not want to claim I understood what I was seeing with any clinical precision. But I have worked with veterans long enough to recognize what relief looks like when it shows up on a face that has been holding against it for a long time. It does not look like happiness. It looks quieter than that. Like a room where a sound you had stopped noticing has finally stopped. He shook the water off his wrists and paddled over to where Theo was floating about 20 meters from the shore, still on his board, still horizontal, still working up to something. He said something to Theo. I could not hear it. Theo looked at him. Then Theo nodded and paddled a few meters further out, turning his board to face the shore. Theo had been in the water for 45 minutes at this point and had not yet stood up on his board. He had tried 6 times. Each time he had gotten to his knees and then something had happened, not physical, nothing to do with balance or technique, and he had slipped back to lying flat. Marcus had not pushed him. Royson had not intervened. This was part of the program's design. The ocean is patient, and patience is contagious if you let it be. The 7th wave came in lower and slower than the ones before it, the kind of wave that looks almost apologetic, as if the Atlantic had noticed what was needed and adjusted accordingly. Theo paddled. He felt the wave take the board, and then both hands flat, one knee, the other knee, one foot. A breath that I could see from the shore from the way his entire back expanded. He stood up. 3 seconds, maybe 4. His arms went out sideways and his face did something that took me a moment to identify because it was not an expression I had seen on him before. Then the wave ran out from under him, and he went sideways into the water and came up with both arms raised and his mouth open, and the sound that came out of him was a laugh, a proper one, not a performance of one. The kind that happens before the brain has time to supervise it. Harry, who was 10 meters away, heard it and immediately raised both fists out of the water and shouted something I absolutely could not hear over the surf, but which made Derek, beside him, punch the water once in celebration. Marcus, who had been watching from slightly further back, said nothing. He simply nodded once in Theo's direction, the way you acknowledge a fact. I became aware that my eyes were doing something embarrassing. I pressed my clipboard to my face for a moment under the pretense of reading it. Royson, next to me, said nothing and looked thoughtfully at the horizon, which I think was her version of the same thing. The wetsuit had ridden up to a point that was now physically uncomfortable. I reached down and tugged it hard, and it made an audible sound. Royson looked at me. I am absolutely fine, I said. She nodded as if this was very believable. They came out of the water at 10:45. Marcus led them up the beach in a loose group, boards under arms, everyone dripping. Someone had set up a small area with towels and the thermos Royson had brought, and there were paper cups of tea that were slightly too small for the quantity of cold people who needed warming, but which were hot and real and enough. Diane was already on her phone, composing something. She had the focused expression of a person converting an experience into a document in real time, which was useful and necessary, and also, I thought, slightly at odds with what had just happened in the water. But that is what program directors do. I would have done the same 6 months ago, before I had stood on enough beaches to know that some things need a moment before they become words. Harry had a towel around his shoulders. He was standing at the edge of the group with a paper cup in both hands, and then he was sitting down, and the person he sat down next to, not deliberately, not as a decision, just as a direction he moved in, was Marcus. The two of them sat in the wet sand, not talking much, watching the water. The protection officers stood a respectable distance away with the expressions of men who had learned not to interpret everything as a situation requiring management. Theo was sitting with Derek, drinking tea, and saying something that made Derek laugh, and then Theo laughed again. And the sound was the same as the one in the water, unguarded, free of supervision. Royson sat on one of the benches and wrote a few lines in her notepad. She would not write anything identifying. She never did. She once told me that the notes she kept were really just a way of making sure she remembered what she had witnessed, because witnessing, she believed, was a form of care in itself. I stood to the side and pulled at my wetsuit, which had now developed a secondary complaint about the right shoulder. I was beginning to suspect the wetsuit was having a worse morning than anyone else on the beach, and had decided to share the experience. A young photographer from the charity press team came down from the ridge and asked me quietly if I could arrange for a group photograph with the prince before he left. I told her I would check with Diane. I also told her that whatever she had captured on the ridge was probably not the photograph from today that would matter in 10 years' time. She looked at me slightly uncertainly. I was not sure I could explain what I meant without sounding like I had sustained a head injury. I told her to give me 5 minutes. The debrief was informal. Royson gathered the group on the benches and asked a simple question, not how did it go, not what did you feel, but simply, what did you notice? About the water, about your body, about anything. The answers were brief and honest in the way that answers are when people have been physically tired out and have no energy left for performance. Derek said the cold was worse than he remembered, but the board was lighter. A man called Callum said he had not thought about anything for the first time in 4 months, and then seemed surprised he had said it out loud. Patrick said his shoulder held better than he expected. Theo said nothing for a moment and then said, "I did not think I was going to get up." A pause. I got up. Nobody embellished this. It was enough. Harry was sitting slightly outside the circle, not part of the formal debrief. That was not his place, but within earshot. When Theo said that, I watched Harry's face. He was looking at the sand in front of him. He turned his paper cup slowly in his hands. Then Royson did something I had not seen her do before in a debrief. She looked at Harry and said, very simply, "Is there anything you noticed?" There was a pause. Diane looked up from her phone. The protection officers did not visibly react, but I felt something shift in their attention. Harry looked at Royson for a moment, then he looked at the group. Then he said, "I noticed that out there past the break nobody knows who you are. The wave does not know, the water does not know." He stopped. I had forgotten what that felt like. Nobody said anything for a beat. Then Marcus said, without looking up from his cup, "Same reason I started doing this." That was the end of the debrief. The Range Rover left at 11:40. Before he got in, Harry went back down the group handshakes, a word with each person. When he reached Theo, he said something that made Theo look at the ground and then look up and nod once, firm, the way you respond to something that has landed accurately. When he reached me, I was holding my clipboard in one hand and attempting, with the other hand and no success whatsoever, to address the situation with my wetsuit. He looked at it. I looked at him. "Still the wrong size," I said. He smiled, a real one, tired and unguarded and nothing like the polished version in photographs. "Some things you just have to get through," he said, and then he shook my hand and walked up the path. Diane appeared at my shoulder the moment the car was out of sight. "Good," she said, in the tone of someone closing a bracket. "The photographer got some very usable images. I am drafting the press summary tonight. I will need your notes by Friday." "Of course," I said. "Also," she said, already moving away, You should take that wetsuit off before the drive home. You look like you are being slowly consumed." This was the most human thing Diane had said to me all morning, and I appreciated it sincerely. I sat on the bench for a while after the vehicles had gone, and most of the team were packing down the equipment. The beach had gone back to being an ordinary Tuesday beach. A couple walking a dog along the waterline, a man with a metal detector moving slowly near the dunes, the waves continuing their long, indifferent business. Royson came and sat beside me. She had her notepad closed in her lap. "What did Marcus say to him?" I asked, out past the break. She was quiet for a moment. "I do not know," she said, "and I would not ask." "Do you think it helped?" She looked at the water. "I think something happened out there that he needed to happen and could not have arranged, which is what the water does. It is not interested in arrangements." I thought about the moment, the forehead against the board, the 4 seconds, the face when he came back in, the laugh in Theo's voice when he stood up, the way Marcus had nodded at it, the way Harry had said nobody knows who you are, and the group had sat with it in the quiet the way you sit with a thing that is true. Royson stood up to help with the equipment. I sat for another minute, the wind off the Atlantic pressing against me. I have been a program coordinator for almost 3 years now. I handle spreadsheets and grant applications and borrowed wetsuits that are not the right size. I am not the person this story is about. I am the person standing close enough to see it. But I will tell you what I know about what happened on that beach on a gray September Tuesday. I know that Theo stood up on a wave for 3 seconds and laughed with his whole body. I know that a man who is recognized everywhere he goes floated in the Atlantic for 4 minutes and said that nobody out there knew who he was, and that he had forgotten what that felt like. I know that Marcus, who built this whole program with one arm and a precision that looks like silence, nodded at both of these things in the same way, with the same calm recognition that says, "Yes, that is what we are here for." I know that the wetsuit was still riding up when I finally peeled it off in the car park, and that the relief of removing it was one of the best physical sensations I had experienced all month. And I know that something happened past the break line that nobody photographed, that it passed between 2 people in cold Atlantic water and was carried back to shore in the silence between them, that it was not in Diane's press summary, and it was not in the charity's social media post, and it will not be in any official account of the visit. It is in Royson's notepad probably, a few lines, witnessed, not analyzed. I keep thinking about what she said on the walk back to the cars. The program has a second session next month. 3 of the veterans from today are already confirmed returning. Theo is one of them. He called the office the day after and left a message with our receptionist. The message, as written down, said only, "Tell whoever coordinates the program that I am coming back, and tell them the wave was bigger than it looked." Royson read the message when I showed it to her. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then she folded the paper carefully and put it in the pocket of her jacket. She has not said what she is going to do with it. I think she is going to keep it. The Fistral Beach Veteran Surf Program runs monthly sessions for veterans experiencing physical and psychological rehabilitation. All participant details in this account have been changed or anonymized. The session described took place in the autumn.